Hey everyone, Mr. Happy here, and welcome back to my Final Fantasy XIV job retrospective series. To celebrate 10 years since A Realm Reborn, I've been going back to all the oldest jobs, really Heavensward and before, and showcasing kind of the olden days versus the newer days, how jobs have evolved over time from their original designs to what we have nowadays, and any critiques therein in between all that time. Funny thing about this video, which is going to be looking at Dark Knight, I thought I did it already. I don't know why, but I had convinced myself that I had done the Dark Knight and Astrologian videos, and I never did. So thank you for letting me know in the comment section, because that's the reason I'm doing it right now. It's because somebody let me know. So basically, we're going to be looking back at the Heavensward skills, comparing it at the beginning of the expansion, the end of the expansion, and then go through Stormblood, Shadowbringers, Endwalker, and just see how the job has changed and talk about the community perspective on the job, or perception of the job at each individual time. To do this, I'm going to be using the Wayback Machine, and sometimes things break when using the Wayback Machine, so certain bits and bobs may not look the most presentable, but hey, it is what it is. So with that, let's get started. Alright, so for way back in the day during Heavensward, we're actually going to be looking back at the old console games wiki, which has all that stuff archived. Most of the images don't work from around the Heavensward era, not really sure why, they just don't. But this will give us our first look into the launch of Dark Knight. Dark Knight might be the most criminally misrepresented on-release job of any job in any expansion, and that is including Samurai and Gunbreaker, which also had similar problems when they first released. TLDR, everyone said Dark Knight was absolutely awful when it initially released. People said it wasn't as tanky as the other jobs, it didn't deal as much damage as the other jobs, and it was essentially considered dead on arrival. Now, while this was also the perception of Machinist and Astrologian during the start of Heavensward, Dark Knight was the one case where everyone was really wrong. Now, don't get me wrong, the job had jank. Many people know nowadays the job still has jank, and thus, there are things people didn't like. But functionally, it became such a huge staple that it alone pushed out 2 jobs from being frequently used in endgame content. It was a real struggle being a paladin or a monk during this time, when Dark Knight could fulfill both of their most important aspects within the tank role and outdamage paladin, which it would share the role with. So without further ado, let's take a look at what made Dark Knight such a menace to deal with in endgame raiding, and why it managed to hold such an important place despite people saying that it was underpowered. Now, here we just have a few of the basics, and honestly, even looking at these nowadays, you're probably going to recognize what a lot of these skills do. You have the hard slash, spinning slash into, what's the last one called? I think like power slash, I think is the last one. It'll be down at level 26. That's when the third part of the combo kicks in. Nothing fancy to say, but you got to remember that this was back when Dark Knight had more than one 3-part combo. They of course had their enmity combo, and they had their damage dealing combo, which was a very interesting place for Dark Knight. It was a very interesting place during Heavensward as a whole, because not only did you have the frequency and infrequency of using tank stance, because people wanted to avoid the damage down that it put on people, especially in endgame raids, and even in like dungeon spams and whatnot. But on top of that, you also had to deal with the actual enmity combo being there, which was often either ignored or used maybe once or twice throughout an entire fight. Now, as for their level 2 ability, Shadow Skin, reduced damage taken by 15%. It's not like back in the day when everyone shared Rampart. They had their own Shadow Skin with 15%, and then they would have Shadow Wall later, which you're more familiar with now. Now, Scourge. This is also back in the day of everybody having a dot. And to this day, you will hear seasoned Dark Knights saying, "Bring back Scourge." Same as you hear "Bring back Fracture," but Dark Knights really want it more than Warriors ever did. It's just an initial bit of damage with some damage over time, and the only point of it was to maintain it for damage. There's nothing else to it, but every job pretty much had this built into it, and Dark Knight was no different. Unleash should be very familiar, except, has added enmity and the additional effect of the next Unleash costing no MP. Nowadays, Unleash doesn't cost MP. It's just one of your AoE options. Back then, it did cost you some MP, and thus, if you ran out of MP, you could not use Unleash, which made AoEing very, very interesting. Don't worry, we'll be talking a bit more about Dark Knight AoE as we scroll down to one of my favorite abilities from back in the Heavensward era. The best thing was when you managed to get that extra you know, no MP unleashed just made everything a whole lot easier. Low blow, just off global cooldown stun. Now, here's the big thing. I say off global cooldown stun, but it also had a 30% chance that the next parry will reset the recast timer. Now, I believe that is only in PvP as it has the duration there. You know what? Maybe it isn't, but I don't really remember that. In all honesty, you know, I played Dark Knight. I played it through dungeons. It was my go-to when I was dungeon running, like most other people. And I don't really remember low blow having that 30% chance. So that's honestly kind of a blast from the past for me, because that isn't a PvP. It'll say in parentheses when something is PvP related, like the 3-second stun on low blow. So yeah, wow, that's pretty cool. Now, of course, that's a roll action that stuns, but back then all of our stuns and interrupts / silences back then, they all came with damage attached to them. So we just spam them off global on bosses that were immune to that kind of stuff. Now, Siphon Strike was the second part combo, branching off your initial one, that led into the damage combo. And just like nowadays, it just does a bit more damage for the combo and then restores MP. It's remained pretty much the same function throughout all of the expansions. Unmend, same deal. Ranged attack, that hasn't really changed much. There's no enhanced unmend back then, but you know. Now, things get really interesting with Blood Weapon, because Blood Weapon was kind of a double-edged sword back in the day. So in Heavensward, we still had TP, and given Dark Knight had to very carefully manage both their TP and MP, Blood Weapon became kind of a problem. Now, I say a problem, but more so something that needed to be managed very properly, because it increased the attack speed of the Dark Knight by 10%. Now, what that means is that they were burning through TP very, very quickly on release. A well-functioning Dark Knight would run out of TP in under 3 minutes on content back in patch 3.05 when the Savage Raid was relevant. It was a huge, huge problem, and it was largely because of Blood Weapon. Now, I know it gets a change at some point, but I don't know when. But the other part is that it converts that physical damage into MP, which you would then, of course, be using to fuel the amount of damage you would deal. But the way MP worked on Dark Knight was very, very different. We have to get to a specific ability, so it makes a bit more sense. But as you could already see, you actually had that MP cost on Unleashed, and there are other things with MP cost throughout the rest of Heavensward as well. Now, it cannot be used while under the effect of Grit either, which means you needed to turn Tank Stance off to even access Blood Weapon. And given that it has a 15-second duration with a 40-second cooldown, yeah, that's kind of uptime that ability had. Again, just fed into the problem with having that increased attack speed and the TP, just people were trying not to turn on Tank Stance, so they were access Blood Weapon all the time. Reprisal, now Reprisal right now is a roll action, AoE damage down, but back in Heavensward, it was a Dark Knight exclusive action. Delivers an attack with a potency of 210 and can only be used immediately after parrying attack. Now, when I say immediately, I think you had about 5 seconds to use it. I don't think it needed to be the next GC. No, it wasn't even a GCD. It's that 30-second cooldown. Yeah, it needed to be used very, very quickly. So you couldn't really save it for anything after a proc. And it only had a 30-second cooldown. So you really wanted to be parrying as frequently as possible. The other thing that it did is it lowered the target's damage dealt by 10% for 20 seconds. So if you parried once every 30 seconds, you had a 66% uptime on reducing damage. The thing is, Dark Knight often wasn't trying to be the main tank in their group. They were trying to make use of Blood Weapon and never at all needing to look at the Grit button as a whole. So they didn't get to use this nearly as much as it would seem useful, which created problems in terms of reliable damage reduction. Not to mention, you never planned on having Reprisal because you just couldn't plan around something that could only be used after parrying. It was just nice to have whenever you could actually get it. Now there's Power Slash. That's the end of the combo. Now here's where we get our first bit into Dark Arts. Now I kind of want to save talking about Dark Arts until we actually scroll down to the ability, but it is the most controversial thing about Dark Knight. Again, one of those things that classic Dark Knights will tell you they want back. And a lot of people who also played it do not want it back. It's kind of, again, a divisive thing between Dark Knight players. Now we get on to Dark Side, which was their main thing they needed to maintain throughout pretty much the entirety of the encounter. Dark Side would slowly drain your MP in exchange for dealing 15% more damage. Also, MP refreshing statuses would have no effect during Dark Side's, well, effect. And you could turn it on and off whenever you wanted with a 5-second cooldown. It was essentially Dark Knight's version of Cleric Stance in a sense. And it was super, super important to have Dark Side up whenever you needed to deal a huge burst of damage. and whenever it was actually safe to. And this was a big part of your MP management, because not only did you have abilities that ate MP, but you wanted to be able to use Dark Side as frequently as possible. The big thing is that while your tank stance, which is right below it, would reduce your damage dealt by 20%, Dark Side would increase it by 15%. So it would kind of offset Grit's damage reduction if you were to use them in conjunction. That being said, most people were trying not to use it in conjunction with Grit, because why would you want to only do that 5% net, which doesn't really work out, because I think those are multiplicative, so it's not actually like a 20 versus 5 equaling a net 5%. You would just want it to gain the 15%, so it just became an important damage tool throughout all that time. Grit, there's the tank stance, like all the rest of them. Reduce damage received by 20%, lower damage dealt by 20%, increase your enmity, and increase the chance to hit by 5%. Important because back in Heaven's Ward, we had accuracy for all the jobs, and for those who weren't around, accuracy worked in 3 different ways. A monster had 3 different accuracy caps that people needed to hit in order to actually deal damage to them when they were attacking. If you were attacking from behind, you needed the least amount of accuracy. From the flanks, a little bit more. But if you were standing in front of something, then you needed a much higher value of accuracy in order to hit. That 5% chance to hit there, well, that's to make up for that. So tanks didn't have to worry about all of that on gear. Sorry, I had to peek over and make sure I remembered to hit record, because for some reason I was doubting myself. Then you have Dark Dance. Not a very good cooldown. Increased parry rate by 20%. And could only be used while under Dark Side. Once a minute, duration 20 seconds. 20% parry rate with nothing else on it. Not very good. Imagine you don't parry anything during that time. Yeah, wasn't great. Wasn't appreciated, wasn't loved. Regularly ridiculed, part of the reason why people said Dark Knight wasn't tanky. I mean, up to this point, I've only read you their Tank Stance, Shadow Skin, and Dark Dance in terms of damage mitigation as a whole. Yes, Reprisal, which is great when you're like tanking a dungeon or something, but again, is not a reliable source of damage reduction. Then we move on to Blood Price, which was also a very interesting skill. So Blood Price would restore partial MP when damage was taken. Hilariously, Dark Knights and White Mages were mortal enemies back in Heaven's Ward, at least for the Dark Knights that weren't paying close enough attention. So in dungeon runs, as you know, even nowadays, White Mage spams Holy, which is an AoE stun. So you'd very often see a Dark Knight pull a bunch of mobs, plus press Blood Price, and then the Holy spam would come out and they would just lose it. A good Dark Knight knew not to do that. A good Dark Knight could see they had a White Mage in the party, see they were casting Holies, and just wait a second to analyze what the White Mage was doing before trying to utilize this skill. At least wait for the first diminishing returns to fall off, so that way you can make sure you got the most value out of getting all those hits, and that you could properly AoE throughout the entirety of your Blood Price and throughout the entirety of a pack. Now, Soul Eater still works largely the same as it did back then. Comboed off Siphon Strike, grants 50% or up to 100% of the damage dealt as HP, but only when under the effect of Grit. So if you didn't have the tank stance on, you weren't restoring HP back then. Very, very important. I think 100% is the PvP value, by the way. Again, in parentheses usually means PvP value. So yeah, that's at this point it was just your damage combo option. Now the big thing is Dark Arts again. Now you're going to see all these Dark Arts names, Dark Arts Fates Upon Execution. Again, we're getting to Dark Arts, but essentially if you press the Dark Arts button before pressing Soul Eater, it did 400 potency instead of 260. Now it's funny because it also lists Dark Arts potency 240 and combo potency. This is what it would be if you just did it without a combo, which is so weird. I mean, I guess I could technically think of a use for it. Like if you had one GCD left, you could Dark Arts it and you had to choose between a hard slash or even a spinning slash for 220, or just straight up Dark Artsing a raw Soul Eater for 240, you might just consider it. You know what I mean? Like it's actually an applicable use, but that almost never actually happened. So, you know, I'm just letting you know that there was a way to apply that. Now, what's interesting is it has a combo of 260, whereas Power Slash has a potency of 300. So if you didn't actually need the MP, or you didn't have Dark Arts at the time for any reason at all, then it actually would be better to Hard Slash, but you had to already know that. The big problem being, of course, if you skip Siphon Strike, you're skipping all the MP that generates. So there's a little bit of decision making, but most of the time, just going for that Soul Eater combo. Dark Passenger. This was an off-global, like, line AoE. I had almost forgotten about this completely. Not too dissimilar from one of the skills that we have nowadays. I believe they're actual, what is it? Is it called Shadowbringer, I think is the name of the skill. Not too dissimilar to it. It was 150 potency in a straight line before you, and could only be used when under the effect of Dark Side. If you Dark Artsed it, it was 250 potency, and also blinded all the enemies that you could hit. So this was one of the complaints, is that Dark Knight had an ability that actively blinded opponents so they couldn't deal damage to the Dark Knight. And also a skill that regenerates MP when you get hit as a Dark Knight. Yeah, a little disjointed. Obviously not the worst thing. If blood price is down and Dark Passenger with Dark Arts is available, then it becomes reasonable damage mitigation. But still a strange thing to do by design. Dark Mind is here, also only available under the effects of Dark Side. You're seeing why it was so important to maintain that. Reduce magic vulnerability by 15%. Hasn't really changed. The big difference is if you Dark Arts it, it would be a 30% magic damage reduction. Now, this is one of the big reasons why it started to outshine Paladin as a whole. Paladin's entire kit was revolved around physical mitigation. You have to remember that we couldn't like block and parry magic back then. You could only block and parry physical attacks. And that was what, you know, a Paladin had the specialty in with all the blocking. Now, while Dark Knight has the parry, Dark Mind essentially made it so that all those bosses with magical tank busters or any sort of big magic hit, the Dark Knight became a much more reliable source of mitigation. And that was a lot of bosses that just had magic auto attacks, magic tank busters and the like. So it just, this alone helped push it more into relevance versus, you know, Paladin, who lost entire bits of its mitigation and only had select bosses it was really effective against. Finally, at level 45, we get to Dark Arts. Attune with the darkness within you, increasing the potency of several actions. Can only be used when succumbing to Dark Side. Effective phase of Dark Side is canceled. So you need to use MP over time to use Dark Side, to then access Dark Arts, to then access other skills that are buffed by Dark Arts. Essentially, when you were doing lots of damage, you were pressing Dark Arts all the time. It was just a button that any time was a reasonable time to press it during Dark Side, you were using Dark Arts to get whatever effect it is you wanted. And so it became very big, busy work, which was not very popular amongst a lot of people. The hilarious thing is, the way that we actually weave off globals on Dark Knight nowadays, specifically in regards to Flood and, I forget the name, Flood and Edge, I believe they are. Sorry, I haven't played Dark Knight and Endwalker very much. Is not too dissimilar to the way it felt to use Dark Arts. The difference being that Dark Arts was a lot more like, and I'm sorry to say this, Samurai's Kaiten, in a sense, where it was just always being used before skills, and it had so many skills that it interact with that you were actually pressing it quite frequently. So because of the busyness that it created for what I guess the dev team eventually determined wasn't a good enough reason, they decided to do away with it, and it's something that classic Dark Knights argue about whether or not they should bring back. I'm not against it entirely, but I think if they did ever bring it back, they'd have to probably change it from being as spammable as it was. Shadow Wall, reduced damage taken by 30%. Once every 3 minutes. What's there to say? Delirium also was back then. Now, this was actually a combo action off of Siphon Strike back then, and was the second reason why Dark Knight pushed jobs out of Raid. So Delirium comboed off Siphon Strike, 280 potency, so, you know, still really good, and reduced the target's intelligence by 10% for 20 seconds. Does not stack with Dragon Kick. That last 2 lines right there is the big thing. What's it called? Monk was really popular for Prog in A Realm Reborn because they were the only job that could apply intelligence down, which meant all the raid wides that were magic damage. Again, tank busters like Akmorn on Bahamut. If a monk wasn't there, it just did, you know, it just wasn't being debuffed all the time. Why would you want that versus having it debuffed all the time? Dark Knight was now preferred over Paladin in the tank slot, so people were taking it anyway. And Monk just had Mantra, which wasn't really that valuable anymore. So Delirium was the other piece. It pushed Monk out of, and not to mention blunt resistance down didn't matter because the only job that really needed the blunt resistance down was the Monk itself, because no one really cared about auto attacks from your White Mage staff hits and whatnot at this point. So yeah, it's this was another reason why Dark Knight was so contentious and why it would eventually see changes, and why things like this, the intelligence down, would get removed not too long after, because it created those types of problems. Living Dead. It's pretty much the same as it is now, except you don't get that regeneration factor where, you know, nowadays when you're landing hits with Living Dead, you get HP back so you can kind of survive yourself. without the need for somebody else to heal you. This was just, you know, when you triggered the Walking Dead effect, you needed to be healed to full or you died when it wore off. That was it. And this was complained about for like 8 years before they, like 7 to 8 years before it was ever changed. So you could tell that they really lived or died by the way that they decided to design this in the first place. It's one of those things we look at and still wonder to this day, even though it like works fine now, will they ever change it? Who knows? Who knows? Salted Earth, very similar to now, creates a patch of Salted Earth, dealing unaspected damage of a potency of 75 to any enemies who enter. 45-second cooldown, 21-second duration. It's all about uptime. Just make sure that it's hitting the boss for those 21 seconds, and you're good. Plunge, they had to wait till 54 for Plunge. Goodness gracious. Not to mention, they were the only job, I think, with a gap closer. I don't think there was Onslaught at this level. And I know the Paladin one wasn't there. So they had Plunge with the gap closer, and that led to many funny occurrences. But it also meant that they had a gap closer that they were also, if they didn't need it for the actual gap closer, they were using it on cooldown for damage, as it was back then. Abyssal Drain. Now, Abyssal Drain nowadays, you know, it feels good to press that one time, but then you kind of wish you could press it more often. Yeah, that feeling stems from the fact that you used to be able to press it as much as you wanted because it was an on GCD AoE. Now, it only did 120 potency, less than your other AoE options, but if you Dark Artsed it, you absorbed 100% of the damage dealt as HP. So yeah, if you just wanted to spam Abyssal Drain back to back, if you had Dark Side, Dark Arts, Abyssal Drain, it's you could heal for a lot. Now, you would drain your MP in no time at all, which is its own problem. But even still, you could basically feel like you had, you know, bloodwetting and whatnot for a brief moment, you know, for a few GCDs. And it was great. And it definitely helped when Dark Knights made use of this intelligently. Speaking of healing, Soul Survivor marks target party member with the status Another Victim. If that target should be KO'd in battle, 20% of your maximum HP and MP will be restored. Soul Survivor, really good for ad fights as the tank, because you could just get a free 20% heal anytime there was an ad. Stuff like A7, stuff like A3 during the actual ad phase with the tethers. Any place where there was an ad that you could reasonably put this once every 2 minutes, you did, and it was super useful. But other than that, kind of useless. like in a fight that has only a boss and no ads, utterly useless. There's a reason why we don't have it anymore. They've removed a lot of those, like either on death or loyal. Like, you gotta remember, we're talking about the era of the game where if you landed the killing blow with Mercy Stroke, you got healed. And it was like anyone's really trying to make that happen. Like, you kind of shoot for it if you're the tank. You're like, oh, let me try and get it. But you never really bank on it because it's just kind of not reliable. Same thing with Soul Survivor. And finally, Carve and Spit, a 3-fold attack with a potency of 100. So 3 different hits, 100 potency each hit. Also restores MP if used while not under the effects of Dark Arts. If you are under the effects of Dark Arts, it does 450 potency. So massive amount of damage. Most people fairly certain opted into the massive amount of damage that it could deal, and thus again just fed to the fact that Dark Knight was doing so much damage. Now, the big thing is, I didn't name a whole lot of mitigation, and that's why people said it wasn't tanky. I mean, the main reason why people ended up saying it wasn't a tanky job was because a lot of new players picked it up and didn't know how to use it. I mean, even to this day, that happens with tanks, so it's not really much of a surprise. But then when all the world first and high tier raiders started bringing it into raids and demolishing with it, then the community perception changed on it. Only because they could see what the top end players were able to do with it. That didn't necessarily mean that the not top end players knew what to do with it. So a bit of a sticky spot. Now, going into their traits, some of those things we mentioned above do get buffed. Shadow Skin goes up to 20%. The Blood Weapon recast going down to 40 seconds. Reprisal recast down to 30. Scourge lasting 30 seconds for the dot. There's the 30% chance on the low blows. There is the 30. Oh, look, Enhanced Unmend. They did have it. Oh, grants a 30% chance that after casting Unmend, your next Unleash will cost no MP. Now, let me go back up to Unleash. Let me see if I maybe read that wrong. Unleash. Nope, just Unleash also had that effect. Just wanted to make sure I didn't misread it, didn't misrepresent it, you know. Improves Dark Dance parry to 30%. Ooh. And then Soul Eater. Oh, no, so it's 100% on trait. Yeah, it's a little confusing the way I had it done. The way they had it done on Console Gamers Wiki back then. But you know what? You got to work with what you got. Then, of course, for cross-class skills, you had to take Provoke. You almost certainly took Awareness, and then absolutely Convalescence. On the Marauder side, You had a few choices. I mean, Foresight was always an option for the defense percent if you really wanted it. But Bloodbath and Mercy Stroke were once again go-tos because who didn't want them? And then, of course, we don't need to worry about Cross Disciple and all the other stuff. But that was how Dark Knight was at the start of the expansion. With the large outcry from the player base, you'd think that maybe there'd have been some changes, even though it was doing really well in the start of the expansion, you know, after a month or so, that, you know, a lot of people complained. So you think maybe they'd make some changes. No, not really. They made almost no changes. Let me shift this over a little bit, or let me extendo. Actually, we can do this. Watch this. Bam. Mid-video edit. There you go. Let's just pull this back over so it's not blue on the right. Almost nothing's different. I mean, now we have the icons on the left. I also noticed that Shadow Skin's only 10% at base, but then 20% still with enhanced traits. So it's not like that really changes anything at max level. Scourge, there you go. Why is it so, it's like it's zoomed in more, and thus it looks kind of ugly. I don't know why this one's zoomed in more than the other ones, but there you go. That looks way, way better. I think there's some very minor change somewhere. Oh, yeah. So Blood Weapon, at some point, I don't know when, while it also reduced weapon skill TP cost by 20%. I think that was fairly early on that they made that change. Not all the way at the end of the expansion, but not at the very beginning. Not to mention, they actually reduced the TP cost of a lot of skills individually, which won't be reflected here, but I know for a fact was the case. They reduced some of them by 10, some of them by 20, and they did that fairly early on in the expansion as well. Reprisal is here again. Pretty much all the same stuff. Power Slash. I think something here also has its potency increased by like 10 over what it was. And then, yeah, you have Dark Dance 30%, but that's, you know, still the same. Dark Arts Evasion increased by 20%. Did they add that on? Because I remember it having... They did. Yeah. Oh, so... Again, remember when I said they have Blood Price? And it's like, ah, yeah, Blood Price. I need to get hit to get my MP back. It grants 20% evasion. It was so weird. It was, and it's right next to it, too. They learned to level apart to boot. Oh, man. Yeah, Dark Passengers. Same. Yeah, I think everything else is pretty much kosher at this point. I think everything else is leveled out. Again, I think something is off by like a little, like they buffed something by like 10 potency or whatnot. But almost everything completely identical from that point on. All of the traits are still the same. Yep, all the traits are still the same. So yeah, that's Heavensward Dark Knight. I mean, clearly the high-end Raiders doing well on it showed the dev team that it didn't really need to be adjusted in terms of its, you know, numbers and whatnot. But fundamentally, it got a lot of complaints. It wasn't very popular. It was very difficult to play. Most people made it not look very good, which is why people thought it was, you know, not great at the early points anyway. But going into Stormblood, Dark Knight would start to undergo some small changes little by little. But here's the thing. Every time it felt like Dark Knight took a small change, by the end of the expansion, it almost always felt like a big change, especially once Dark Arts was gone, which I don't remember if that was Stormblood, but we're about to check. So that's it for Heavensward Dark Knight. Let's move on to Stormblood. All right, and with that, we bid adieu to the Console Games Wiki. We only need it for Heavensward because starting in Stormblood, we had the job guide site, which once again, I'm using the Wayback Machine to check. We're only going to be sticking to the PvE actions, and this is from June 23rd, 2017. If I recall, this would have actually been, I think that's the early access date. Because the June 23rd is when Heavensward released in 2015. I think it was June 23rd for early access and June 26th or 27th for the Stormblood release. So yeah, here we can actually see the changes because it goes into the 4.0 adjustment. So Unleash getting learned a little bit earlier, its potency being decreased, but its enmity effect being increased. Siphon Strike being acquired a little bit earlier, also had its Dark Arts potency and combo effects have been added. So now you could Dark Arts Siphon Strike, which was still around, Dark Arts still around in Stormblood, would be gone in Shadowbringers, in order to restore more MP. So if you were desperate, you could use it for that. Now keep in mind, restores MP while under the effect of Grit. Yeah, that was the big thing here. Now, let me refresh my own memory real quick and go down to our good old buddy Grit, which was level 30, which did still do this, but we no longer had accuracy, so it didn't have the increased chance to hit. I had forgotten about that Siphon Strike had its potent. Well, the Siphon Strike was only potency for 390. I think at some point they made Dark Arts restore more MP, because I don't think the potency changed the amount of MP you restored, but I'm trying to remember that. But the effect MP Restoration now increases while under the effect of Grit. Yeah, that was toxic. That was really, really toxic that they added that. I don't remember if that survived until the end of the expansion. Unmend, more enmity. Blood weapon recast time reduced from 60 to 40 seconds. I guess at base they got rid of the trait and just made it 40 seconds. Attack speed by 10%. They changed it to just say everything. Weapon skill recast, spell cast, like all of this is what attack speed did. But now it just says all of those things. Converts physical damage into MP, reduces TP cost by 20%, also increases the blood gauge by 3 each time a physical attack lands. So they changed all that wording, made it way longer, and then added, of course, gauges in Stormblood, and Blood Weapon would grant you some blood gauge each time a physical attack landed. Very important that it's a physical attack, because that means Unleash didn't work on Blood Weapon, so it's worth saying. However, you did get the speed up. You just didn't get, well, the final and probably most important effect. And still can't be used while under the effect of Grit. Power Slash. Enmity increase. Grit no longer the chance to hit. Otherwise, completely identical. Darkside had its base effect increased to 20%. Again, I guess the trait was gone, so they just made it 20%. And MP regeneration now stops during battle, and refresh statuses granted by others have no effect. Yeah, so just making sure that the Darkside effect was a full commitment of your MP just now completely stopping. It already had a similar effect in the previous expansion, but now it's just like during battle, MP regeneration gone while Darkside is on. That's like just the wording change and the actual effect changes. It's just minor for clarification. Blood Price now not only restored partial MP when damage was taken, still a bit of a kerfluffle with the white mages, increased blood gauge by 1 immediately upon using it, and then another 4 over time while in battle. So in other words, just having it active was mostly effective. Grit must now be in effect to execute. So you need to be in Grit to Blood Price. Toxic again. And the amount of partial MP restored when damage is taken has been reduced. So yeah, they started trying to force Dark Knight to commit to Grit for some of these things, and Dark Knights did not like that very much. It meant that when they were playing without Grit, they basically didn't get to use a bunch of this stuff. And, well, I don't think I need to tell you much about how they probably responded to that. Soul Eater. Potency for combo and Dark Arts combos increased, and the Grit combo now, instead of absorbing 50%, now just says absorbs a portion of damage dealt. So it just changed the language, changed the calculation for it. And then the combo bonus of increasing blood gauge by 10 has been added since it is the final part of the combo. Which is funny because, as you can see, Power Slash doesn't have that. So again, just really trying to get you to commit wholly to those Soul Eater combos whenever you could get to them. Dark Passenger potency reduced, but the base potency reduced considerably, and the Dark Arts potency only reduced a little bit. But the MP cost increased. Yeah, that wasn't a very popular change either. Although it worked out fine, it was just still wasn't a popular change. Dark Mind unchanged. Dark Arts now only has a 2-second recast timer. And then you have Salted Earth, additional effect, increased blood gauge by 1 has been added. So that would every time you tick, I think it was every enemy you hit and every tick you got, increase the blood gauge, but it might have just been increased by 1 per tick, and then it went up by 7. I don't really remember. I'm almost certain, though, that it was per enemy hit that Salted Earth was giving you that. Abyssal Drain, Dark Arts has been changed, absorbs a portion of damage dealt as HP, so no longer 100%, but still was absorbing HP. And then we get new actions as a whole. So the Delirium combo action was taken out, and instead they got the Delirium actual action, which just outright restored MP on a 2-minute cooldown. It also extends the blood weapon and blood price effects by 8 seconds and 16 seconds respectively, with a blood gauge cost of 50. So very important to use when you're doing your burst on that job, because, or while you were on Grit just to get MP back, because why wouldn't you want that? Imagine just having your blood weapon suddenly be 8 seconds longer. You would want that anytime you could have both of those up at the same time. And you would almost never want to use it on blood price, even though technically it is an effective button to press. Quietus, which you're very familiar with now, just AoE attack, costs 50 blood gauge. Not really much different than the way it works nowadays. You could Dark Arts it, though, so it could be a potency of up to 210. Blood Spiller, very similar. You know, it's the way it is now. The big thing is that it had big potency, especially if you Dark Arts it. Now, Dark Arts and Grit separately, it had higher potencies. This, of course, for Grit was to make up for the damage reduction, and Dark Arts to reward you for doing Dark Arts, for using it. If you did Dark Arts and Grit together, it had a really, really high potency, again, to try to offset the damage reduction of Grit. So Blood Spiller, like it is now, it was a classic back then. It was super important to get during burst windows, and very strong. And then, of course, TBN, which I don't even need to tell you about. You know how TBN works. It's pretty much worked the same way. The big difference is the way it works nowadays is slightly different, but the idea is you always wanted to make sure the shield broke. You never wanted the shield to actually last its entire duration. Creates a barrier around itself that absorbs 20% of your max HP, or around a party member that absorbs 10% of your max HP. So when you give it to party members, it's only 10%. It also only lasted 5 seconds versus I think it lasts 7 seconds currently on live. So it was a bit of a headache to use. A lot of people complained about the short time it was available and the effective use of that only being 10% on party members. But again, all of these tools still worked really well. Just if you were not in if you weren't in Grit, you couldn't use some things, and thus it got a little bit more boring, especially without needing to maintain Delirium. So there were some Dark Knights who weren't a fan of some of these changes. They lost Shadowskin, Scourge. This is when the Scourge complaint started. That low blow with that 30% parry return, Reprisal, and we all know where that's going to go. Dark Dance, because everyone didn't like it anyway, and the original Delirium, which was replaced with the new Delirium. Now, this is also where we got roll actions, and the reason why some of those skills are gone is because they're here. Rampart, replace Shadowskin, 20% damage reduction. Low Blow, no longer deals damage, stuns target 5 seconds, roll action. Provoke, would have needed, Gladiator in the previous expansion anyway. Convalescence was taking it anyway. Anticipation, Dark Dance. Dark Dance became a roll action, essentially. So yeah, that was where that went. Reprisal, this was lowers single target damage dealt by 10%, but only for 5 seconds. It was ultra annoying how little time it actually lasted. But, people still made great use of it. Awareness, that was, an old cross-class action that they would take, or that they could take from Gladiator. Now roll action. Interject, silence. There you go. That was a paladin thing for the most part. Ultimatum, AoE Provoke, really cool roll action for all the tanks, and Shirk, which you still know how that works nowadays. As for their traits, almost all the traits were removed. They just had Enhanced Vitality and Black Blood and Enhanced Black Blood, which was just so they could actually access their blood gauge. They get blood gauge, it goes up to 50, they can use Blood Spiller, Quietus, all that junk, and that was what they tried to do during burst windows. I don't actually remember too much if Dark Knight changed that much going into the end of the expansion. Now, unfortunately, here we don't have all of the number differences for comparison, so we kind of got to do this the old-fashioned way and go back and forth a little bit. Unleash having 50 potency, because I don't remember if they actually got too much. It's still 50 here. Siphon Strike. Let's see. MP Restoration increase. Yeah, so now combo action. Oh, wait, let me make sure I didn't misread it before I say that. Combo bonus restores MP restoration increase while under the effect of Grit. Yeah, so it's still pretty much the same. It still restored some MP, just not nearly as much unless you were in Grit. That's what I meant to say before, but I was speaking too fast. My bad. And then Blood Weapon, still 10% for all that. Increase blood gauge by 3 every time a physical attack lands. That's just still exactly the same. And 40-second cooldown, 300, Dark Arts, and combo potency of 440 on Power Slash. Ah, that's right. I forgot they gave Power Slash a Dark Arts combo potency. They made Dark Arts able to affect Spinning Slash. I don't remember if that actually made it popular, though, because it had 440 potency, but I think most people still went the road of, Soul Eater, because it also gave the blood gauge, which, Power Slash doesn't do right here, as you can see. Grit the same, Dark Side pretty much the same. I don't know if its MP costs were adjusted because the MP is not listed on the site initially for whatever reason that is. And then you have Blood Price every time you suffer damage, whereas here I think it was 1 on the initial use. Yeah, 1 immediately and 4 over time. Whereas here it's now 1 every time you suffer damage and 4 over time. I actually forgot there was even that version that just gave you 1 initially, like, why? Here, you want to take as many hits as possible, which makes sense because that was already the point of the skill, was to restore partial MP when damage is taken. So it also restores blood gauge whenever damage is taken. Much better version of it that got buffed in the middle of the expansion. Soul Eater with the 440 combo potency as well. So never mind, they actually bumped that up to 440 and they were both 440. Difference being, of course, Soul Eater gave you blood gauge. So you wanted to use it more no matter what anyway. Dark Passenger, pretty much identical. Looks like they gave it a Dark Arts potency buff, although I don't remember if that actually made it more popular to Dark Arts. I think it may have, but it's still 2400 MP. And then you have Dark Mind at 30%. Dark Arts still here. Shadow Wall 30%. They changed the cooldowns yet on that? Did that start? Yeah, so they did. I thought so. They lowered Shadow Wall from 3 minutes down to 2 minutes at some point as well. Living Dead still 5, Salted Earth still 75, increased the blood gauge by 1. Dark Artsing Plunge. Yeah, they added Dark Arts to Plunge. Also completely forgot they did that, and also made it increase enmity when you did. I don't remember. I think the idea was Dark Arts should always add 140 potency. Am I remembering that correctly? Like everything that has Dark Arts on it, yeah, I think that's the case. Yeah, that is. So Dark Arts, they always made effectively a 140 potency increase, which kind of just meant that if you weren't looking for any of the bonus effects and you just wanted bonus damage, it had a bit more flexibility because it was just being placed all over. Obviously, you have to factor in crit multipliers, but all the same, you know, it still was the point of making it consistent across all of the jobs. Then you have Abyssal Drain, you know, a portion of the damage dealt, all that, you know, normal stuff. Soul Survivor, which is 30%. Let's see. Oh, I actually forgot that they made this change. Let me read Soul Survivor here. Marks target. If the target is KO, 20% of your max HP will be restored. I forgot they made this change. At some point, they made Soul Survivor. 30% of your max HP and MP will be restored if they are KO'd. If the effect just outright expires, you got 20% of your HP and MP back. That made it much more useful across the 2 minutes, so you still needed to be thinking the 15-second duration in advance to actually get the timed heal, but much, much better. I had also completely forgotten they had done that. Carve and Spit also here. Dark Arts potency was 450. That's a lot. That's a lot. I forgot that was so much, even though I just read it 2 seconds ago. Delirium, still pretty much the same. I don't know if they changed the cooldown on it. They did. It went from 120 seconds down to 80 seconds. Quietus, just 50 black blood for the blood gauge. Restores own MP. Was that here before? Get out of my way. Yeah, no, that wasn't there either. They made it restore MP in the middle of the expansion. There you go. Blood Spiller, pretty much exactly the same. All the potencies exactly the same. And TBN, which was still also the same by this point. The only other change I know for certain is that they made the roll actions. You, at the start of the expansion, had to pick 5 out of the 10. By the end, or even I think the middle-ish of the expansion, you could just choose to take all 10 actions and then use them as you saw fit. So that was the only other change we had. So Dark Knight still had its Dark Arts here, but it underwent a few small, weird changes that needed to be balanced out, which shows that it was a little bit off comparatively the way it was. But, you know, with only 3 tanks in the game and, you know, the blocking problem still being a problem, Paladin honestly was kind of cast to the wayside again. You saw it a little bit more in Stormblood. It definitely wasn't as much of a problem. Some of the stuff Paladin got going from 60 to 70 was definitely very appreciated. But Dark Knight Warrior was still kind of the go-to. It wouldn't be until Gunbreaker came in and shook things up that you really saw that change. But that's it for Stormblood Dark Knight, so let's hop into Shadowbringers. All right, and here we go on to Shadowbringers. This is from June 27th, 2019. I think that's like the day before early access. I think it was like the 28th or something for early access. Either way, once again, we get to look at the revisions from the end of Stormblood, and now is when the Dark Knights started really complaining. Shadowbringers was a big on the tanks, all kind of comparing themselves and really feeling homogenized, and a lot of people will echo that sentiment across a lot of other jobs. And that's going to be incredibly apparent, especially because, as you'll see soon, Dark Arts ain't here. So Hard Slash base potency went up, and you're going to see that a lot. A lot of the revisions are potencies going up because potencies just went up in Shadowbringers. I mean, we were hitting for crazy numbers going into Shadowbringers here. You know, Dark Arts, all that stuff removed. Grit no longer affecting MP restoration because tank stances also would see significant changes going into Shadowbringers. Unleash here, MP cost has been completely removed. That was very much appreciated, and its combo potencies going up. Of course, all the potencies, like I said, going up, so I don't even really need to mention that. Grit just increased enmity generation, same way it works right now. You pretty much just look at that. So all the other effects of it were removed. Unmend, of course, MP stuff, all removed. And then Soul Eater reworked pretty considerably. Made available a good deal earlier because they got rid of the third part combo for the Power Slash. That was gone. So now just Soul Eater would become the level 26 ability. All the Dark Art stuff was removed. Combo bonus action for restoring HP was removed, or like the Dark Arts one was removed, but the base one is still there. Combo bonus action restore own HP was added and granted 20 blood gauge. So yeah, you can just see all the effects. They essentially just all the elements of the MP being like much tighter to manage. TP, you know, gone at this point already. You know, having the tank stance stuff gone, having Dark Arts gone, like Dark Knight lost pretty much all of its resource management in exchange for the blood gauge management and some light MP management. Definitely nothing compared to what they were dealing with before. Trying to increase its accessibility, but not all the career Dark Knights at this point were very impressed with a lot of this stuff. You know, obviously, again, that homogenization discussion was had a lot around this time, and Dark Knight definitely felt, I guess, streamlined. I mean, I believe Shadowbringers is when we got oh, look, it's Warrior 2 for Dark Knight. We'll see when we scroll down in a bit. Blood Weapon, increasing the blood gauge by 10 and restoring MP upon landing weapon skills or spells, but only lasting 10 seconds. So making sure you got all of your GCDs in that 10 seconds was super, super important. A change that would not be undone for probably way too much time when they finally made Blood Weapon stacked way, way later on. Shadow Wall being 30%, just acquired a few levels earlier. And then getting a new ability, Edge of Darkness, Edge and Flood, as you know. Bread and Butter skills, you can see them both right here. Now grant the Dark Side effect, increasing damage dealt by 10%. Duration is 30 seconds up to 60 seconds. And I mean, that's the same way it works nowadays. We just have the upgraded versions as well. So yeah, that's really all there is to say about those. If you know how it works now, then you know how it worked back then. These are just the lower level versions. Living Dead, again, pretty much identical, much to many people's dismay. Salted Earth now at a 90-second cooldown on it. Obviously didn't have its blood gauge effect anymore. Only lasted for 15 seconds and had its potency reduced. A lot of not Salted Earth enjoyers at this point because it was just you used it less. It didn't have any bonus effects. It dealt less damage than it did before. And you just needed to make sure that you landed those 15 seconds inside of a boss hitbox or you were going to be very, very sad. Plunge getting 2 charges was a big thing as well. All the Dark Art stuff being removed. Abyssal Drain, 1 minute. I'm sure we're all very familiar. It was then, instead of being a spell, it was now categorized as an ability because it was an off-global, well, ability. No increased enmity, no Dark Arts effect. The Restore's own HP effect was added, but only a cure potency of 200, not based on much of anything else. Just hit each target, get a 200 potency heal. So still useful, but not nearly as fun as it was before. Carven Spit, the 3-fold attack with a potency of 450 because they got rid of all the Dark Arts related stuff. And also just restored MP because you no longer needed to worry about Dark Artsing it for the damage or not Dark Artsing it in order to get MP. They just kind of streamlined all the effects into the same thing. Blood Spiller, just way higher potency and all the Dark Art stuff being gone. Same with Quietus, but they did remove the Restore's own MP effect at that point. Delirium then became in a release. You know, allows the execution of Quietus and Blood Spiller without cost, restoring MP when landing either weapon skill. So they got rid of the on-use effect for Quietus and added it onto Delirium because you were going to use it anyway. So yeah, it was just about getting as many Blood Spillers or Quietus within your Delirium window, much like with your Blood Weapon window as well. Then you had TBN, which was just 25%, 7 seconds. It was always funny because whenever they buffed the actual HP percent on Blackest Night, it both became better and worse at times. Almost anytime you really needed it, it was pretty much guaranteed to break. But it's still funny that you'd be like, oh man, if that was the unbuffed Blackest Night, then it would have broken in that case. But yeah, now it's just 25% across everyone, which was definitely the better solution. Then we get into the brand new abilities that are from leveling past 70. Stalwart Soul, just your Unleash combo. You know, just go Unleash, Stalwart Soul, Unleash, Stalwart Soul. Restores MP, increases blood gauge by 20. You have Flood and Edge of Shadow. Just the upgraded versions of the other ones that we had at the earlier levels. Otherwise, a very similar effect. Dark Missionary, which dug into that magic damage taken reduction job identity a little bit more with AoE magic damage reduction. And Living Shadow, which works the same way it did back then. Well, it does work a bit differently now. They've made changes to it. Once every 2 minutes, 50 blood gauge, 24 seconds. Takes forever to come out, but then blasts opponents for that entire time. I mean, honestly, very familiar to the way we have now, but no Soul Survivor, no Dark Arts, no Dark Passenger, no Blood Price, Dark Side, Power Slash Spain. A lot of their management and some of their enmity skills just gone. Then going into role actions, a lot of this stuff's still very familiar. Provoke being available a good bit earlier and only being 30 seconds. Also the extra enmity, so it was a little bit easier to tank swap. They got rid of silences, so interject is now the interrupt effect. Reprisal lowers the target's damage dealt, just available a little bit earlier. Not much else has changed with it. And them getting arm's length, so they had a proper knockback resist, but it also had a 2-minute cooldown. Whoa. Granted, of course, the slow plus 20% when barrier is struck has always been an underutilized tank tool. Even to this day, tanks will forego using arm's length in dungeons, even though it is a massive, massive means of reducing damage taken. That slow plus 20%, that ain't a little bit, that's a lot. And then, of course, Shirk, which is all the same. As for their traits that were updated, Enhanced Blood Mend 2 was the effect allows for blood gauge accumulation while under the effect of blood weapon or blood brace has been changed to allows for blood gauge accumulation upon landing any weapon, skill, or spell while under the effect of blood weapon. Whereas prior to that, before you hit level 66, only skills that designate a blood gauge accumulation would actually generate it. Stuff like Soul Eater, for example. Then you had Dark Side Mastery, which upgraded Flood and Edge of Darkness to Flood and Edge of Shadow, and Enhanced Plunge, which gave you the second charge. There's not really much else to say. This is very familiar to current Dark Knight, and I don't believe that actually changes much going into the end of Shadowbringers as well. I do believe there are some very minor balance changes throughout Shadowbringers, but I don't think there's anything too crazy. Let's go back up and do some comparisons, shall we? We have Unmend, which still has the damage, the enmity. Soul Eater, Blood Gauge, 400 potency. Pretty sure that's all the same. Yeah, the cure potency is 300. Here's 300 again. Then you have Flood and Blood Weapon, which was still the 10-second duration and still the 1-minute cooldown. Then you had Dark Mind, which was the 20%. I don't think that changes at any point. It sure don't. Living Dead, which is still as toxic as it ever was. Yeah, it took them a really long time to finally change Living Dead. I kind of forget how long it took for them to change it. It was an Endwalker, so yeah. Salted Earth, is that the post-nerf potency? It sure is. Still exactly the same. Just so you're clear, this is from August 11th, 2020. August 11th, 2020. That's actually not the end of the expansion. So let me get the end of the expansion numbers real quick. I thought I had them, but that's definitely not it. All right, well, here we go. We should hurry up because, as you can see, Ivy is getting a little bit upset with me for spending all my time working on this tonight. But I don't think anything really much changes. This is from much closer to the end of the expansion. As you can see, it's April 13th, which I know is still several months before, but they were pretty much done making job-related changes at this point. You know, they were mostly focusing on expansion-level changes, and I don't think much of anything actually changes here. I think the big thing is that the Blackest Night grants Dark Arts when the barrier is completely broken, which then allowed for the free Edge of Shadow or Flood of Shadow. That just made it so it was a little bit more rewarding. What a big complaint I do remember this now in Shadowbringers was that if you chose to do Blackest Night, you were then choosing essentially to lose damage, which, you know, nobody was actually a fan of. You know, nobody's like, yes, let me choose to just deal less damage and not actually do that. And let's make sure I didn't miss. Oh, wait, no, that effect is here. Is this? See, now I've gotten them all mixed up. No, that's from 811. Hold on. See, now I'm going to go back and check all this stuff. Okay, because now I've got myself all turned around. No, it does. It grants Dark Arts when barrier is completely broken. Okay, see, that I think they just made it more clear in the description. I don't know how I forgot to actually mention that when we were looking back. But yeah, they just made it so that if you used it correctly, you made sure that it wasn't a DPS check. So that's not even a change. Sorry, I've been recording for like almost an hour now, and it's a lot of text to go through. Dark Missionary, Living Shadow. Yeah, I think there's some small changes here or there, but once again, Dark Knight kind of goes relatively under the radar, minus a few small things, I believe, because, I mean, it was performing. Well, most people, this was the big thing everyone was complaining about. They're like, please change it. Next patch, they didn't change it. Please change it. Next patch, they don't change it. That was very frustrating. A lot of people weren't a big fan of the fact that that took so long to get properly resolved, but in the end, it all worked out. And then I don't remember, and then I know Reprisal got a change. That's not really a Dark Knight thing, so this was made AoE at some point throughout the expansion. But other than that, I don't think anything else much changes here. So with that, we can just catch right back up to the end of, well, Endwalker, and you'll have your job retrospective for Dark Knight. All right, so at the start of Endwalker, even this is kind of like, it's been a while, even since the start of Endwalker for me. And so we see a few potency nerfs and a few potency changes going throughout because they brought a lot of the Shadowbringers potencies down a little bit going into Endwalker. You got to remember that they did do the stat squish. So that was a large component as to them needing to rebalance a lot of this stuff. So going into the expansion, I mean, a lot of this stuff is just like, there's not really much to say about it. Yeah, you do have, enhanced unmend showing up there with the 5-second reduction on plunge, which does occasionally have its uses. But I think, the recast on Flood and Edge of Darkness being made shorter, so that way they're a little bit more fluid to use. And then you have Salted Earth changes. This was still 90 seconds. Deals unaspected to the 60 potency instead of 50 potency. Oh, wait, no. So it's 50 instead of 60 now. And then added action changes to Salt and Darkness upon execution. That's the follow-up hit that they have in Endwalker. Then you've got, Plunge, which had its range increased. Abyssal Drain, which restores MP again. I actually didn't even notice that. But now it shares a recast with Carven Spit. I had forgotten that was a change. And then Carven Spit is here, 510 potency, but, now shares the potency, shares the cooldown with Abyssal Drain. Blood Spiller, potency change, updated the effects of Delirium. Now it's just 3 stacks of Delirium for Quietus and Blood Spiller, but otherwise still very much identical, restoring MP when landing either weapon skill. TBN, still pretty much identical. Stalwart Soul, I think it's just a potency change. Potency and recast change for Flood and Edge of Shadow. Then the Living Shadow. I know they made it a much more succinct thing to use. Additional effect, Simulacrum is able to execute Shadowbringer, delivering an attack to all enemies in a straight line, which is their level 90 skill Shadowbringer, which I believe is when the Living Shadow actually gets access to it anyway. They also got the double stack Oblation, which you have now, Salt and Darkness, which I already mentioned, and then in terms of traits, they had the Enhanced Living Shadow for Shadowbringer, the initial potency increase, melee mastery, and Enhanced Unmend. Woo! I think the Living Dead change is the only thing, or the Walking Dead. No, Living Dead. I was right. Walking Dead is the name of the other debuff. Yeah, this changes, I think, in 6.1 to make it so that you can actually restore HP. But you can see that now. This is just the current one. The most important change, of course, is going to be the Living Dead with the Cure potency change. Look at the size of this description. Yeah, so now, of course, as you know, that's kind of like the big change that's happened. There are some other little changes here or there as well, but, at this point, you know what Endwalker's live version looks like. We're really looking at those olden days. But yeah, Dark Knight, it's had a bit of a journey, and I know that every expansion, you hear classic Dark Knight saying, please bring back Scourge, please bring back Dark Arts, and who knows, maybe one day they'll do that. Not! Ha ha ha! No, but seriously, I don't play Dark Knight, so whatever Dark Knights want, go for it. Keep asking for it. And if it works out, then, good for you. It won't affect me. So at the end of the day, if they can come up with something that is similar to what people remember it for and still fun and not just overly, APM heavy or more APM heavy than some of the jobs already are, then go for it. I know other people also want the 3-part combo to, not be the only thing that you have to do, so I don't blame you for that either. So we'll see what changes they get. We won't be finding out anytime soon. We won't be finding out till probably within 6 weeks of Dawn Trail's release. So sometime maybe late spring or early summer, depending on when Dawn Trail releases. But best of luck. Best of luck to hoping on all that for all you Dark Knights out there. Anyway, that's going to be a wrap for this retrospective video. Thank you for watching. We still have Astrologian to do, and I'll try to get that out before the end of the month. Anyway, thanks for watching. Be sure to like, favorite, subscribe, and share, and stay tuned for all the usual Final Fantasy shenanigans. Anyway, I'll see you in the next one, and until then, take care.